Dear Dr. Lisle, given the profitability of prescribing pills and surgical procedures, do you believe that the mainstream medical industrial complex will ever reach a tipping point and head in the direction of actual true healthcare, as opposed to the current system of what basically boils down to disease maintenance?
The way the world works and the way life works is that organisms respond to incentives. So each person or each mouse or moose is simply running cost benefit. So the current system is what it is. I wouldn't say it's just disease management. I don't think we can characterize medicine with one description. In other words, there's people, emergency room physicians that are in there all their entire shift with their whole staff and doing nothing other than trying to save that person's life as ingeniously as possible. And there's surgeons that are putting people's knees and arms and hips back together. And there's people that are cutting cataracts out of eyes and helping people see. So I'm not one to sort of take the whole thing in total. However, I understand the questioner's frustration in that for many chronic disease processes, they're not really interested in any kind of serious education for patients in order to help them understand what they could do to help themselves. It's not cost effective. There's no incentive for them to do it. It isn't that they want people to continue to be sick. It's just that it's too much trouble. They're not in the business of attempting to engineer behavior change in the face of the pleasure trap or anything else. It's just not their job. And so do I think that that's going to change? And the answer is no. I think the pleasure trap is a vastly underestimated motivational dilemma. And I don't think that education is, in general, very effective or likely to be very effective. It's only likely to be helpful for a very small percentage of the population with unusual motivation, unusual intelligence, and conscientiousness. You don't have to be a genius, but you have to have an unusual combination of three things. You have to have sufficient intelligence, sufficient motivation, and sufficient conscientiousness. Those three things are rarely housed in the same individual. And when they are, and they're exposed to the information that we talk about, people can make spectacular recoveries. For those of us that know that this is true, it's frustrating to watch sort of a herd go over the cliff, as it were. But that is the way it's going to be. And that's because this problem is essentially... we're looking at the potency and control of human instinct and instincts in general and the impact they have on behavior. And so it's going to continue to be what it is that we're seeing now. And with all kinds of little slivers of excellence all over it, sort of sparkling through. But the general model is going to be the model that you see. Not because it's inherently evil, it's inherently giving people what it is that they're going to want, which is going to be a quick fix to whatever it is that what ails them. And in that process, they're going to be very, very profitable and steady and stable as an industry. And so that's what you're going to get for the rest of our lifetimes. And whether or not there's any any revolution or evolution towards something very different that takes place in the future, it will be a long, long ways in the future. It's not going to be in our lifetimes.
It's fascinating because I know Dr. Goldhammer used to tell me, and he's said this before, is that the only motivators that he's seen is when people have enough pain, debility, or they fear imminent death.
Yeah, in other words, that's a sort of a somewhat jaded Goldhammerian view of the situation, but not too far off. There are certainly people that, with sufficient intelligence and conscientiousness, They don't have to be in any pain. They can simply be access the information, and they don't have to be in that much fear. They just happen to be unusually conscientious, and they can grab a hold of the appropriate information and head the right direction, and get good results for themselves. So that, but what he's saying has a lot of truth in it, and it's similar to what it is that I'm saying. That this is not something that 25% of people are going to do. Is they're going to say, well, gee, I don't want to be a diabetic like my father and have my toes cut off. Now that I heard Dean Ornish talk, I'm going to do what he says to do. No, that's not going to happen. It's going to be 1%, 2% of humanity that will wake up and essentially seize this opportunity to change their destiny. The 98% won't. That it doesn't mean that they're pathetically stupid or incredibly low in conscientiousness, etc. It just means that they're people, and they're people that are facing. There's a reason we call it a trap, and it's one hell of a trap. And the subtitle of our book is "Mastering the Hidden Force That Undermines Health and Happiness," and it's because it is a hidden force. It's not easily observed and seen and understood, and it's also, we could have said, mastering the Titanic hidden force. You know what I mean? In other words, the force is very strong, and it's enough to defeat the humans that are within its reach, and it basically does. In other words, most people are going to go through this life generally not horribly compromised by the pleasure trap, but to some significant extent. And as they go into later years post 50 and they start to wind up with health problems that are chronic as a result of this, they're going to wind up in modern medicine's care. And if they heard differently, they're not going to have the tenacity and the intelligence and the motivation to actually take themselves into a new direction. That isn't their fault. That just means that it's kind of like if we're trying to teach people advanced mathematics, sort of post-differential equation mathematics, and it was extremely important for their lives that they learn it. Most people simply couldn't do it. There would be a percentage of people that could do it, and they would if they could. If it was, if you get out of prison, if you can get a 90% on this final in Maxwell's equations analysis or whatever the hell it is, the 95% of people simply would not be able to do it, even if it would mean their freedom. Wouldn't be possible. And so this is similar to the problem that we have with the pleasure trap, that this is beyond the skill or talent or whatever it is doesn't seem that complicated. But that's because we're looking at it from a particular view from within the system, and as a handful of the people that have the conscientious intelligence and for whatever reason the motivation to have done this. For us, if you're a Colin Campbell or a Caldwell Esselstyn, it doesn't seem like it's that tough, but that's because you're out of touch, just as a fine mathematician would be out of touch with the difficulties that a far lesser mind would have when it comes to grasping complex algebra. It just seems like it's all logical, and you should be able to do this, and it shouldn't be difficult to do, and you just do it. And if your life depends upon it, you just do it. That position or perspective literally cannot grasp the limitations that other people are having when they face this. It's kind of like, I've seen it, in sports since I was a kid, where the highly athletic kids are like, it's just not a problem. You just jump up and touch the rim. And it's like, yeah, I don't have those fast twitch fibers, and so I can't just go up and touch the rim. And I can remember Alan and I playing with a guy when we were in junior high school that could easily get up and soar to the rim. And I remember Alan saying, God, he just makes it look so easy. And he did. His name was Jim, and he had spectacular leaping abilities. And we watched him, and it's like, man, it's just so much easier for him. And that's true with the facility with which some people can handle the pleasure trap. It's just so easy for them. But they don't understand what it's like to be in the rest of humanity. And the rest of most of humanity will, you could just imagine sort of a person's, forget the middle of the bell curve. Let's go down one notch below the middle of the bell curve. And let's just go there for IQ. So we're going to take a 25th percentile person that's going to try to see through. You're going to go to the doctor, and you're supposed to have enough independent thinking to say, you know what? A friend of mine just told me that this book, which I can't read, contradicts what all the doctors in my healthcare system say. And yet, if I'm sufficiently independent and I go against all my instinct for pleasure seeking and essentially tell my doctor, you know what? I think you're wrong, and I'm not going to take your medication. I'm going to eat this food instead. And the doctor says you're crazy, and it's going to be very dangerous for you if you do this. It's like, how many of those 25th percentile IQ minds have the capability of doing that? Like, I don't know, 1 in 5,000? And we're not talking about outlying people here. We're talking about real, live, regular people. And then, even if we go up to someone with sufficient intelligence to maybe have the independent judgment to read that book and to consider that the arguments are logical and look at the empirical support. So we're talking about a 75th, 80th percentile mind. How many of them are sufficiently disagreeable that they would actually go in the teeth of what it is that their physician would say? And then how many of those that are sufficiently intelligent, sufficiently disagreeable, have the conscientiousness to actually consistently go against the pull of the pleasure trap? You start to see the magnitude of the problem. And the problem was not engineered by greedy corporations. What capitalism does is it flows resources towards what people express that they want through their willingness to trade their hard-earned labor for whatever product or service that you have. And the product or service that has emerged has been, give me a pill and I'll feel a little bit better. And give me a pill and reassure me that this is the way to go on this thing. And so what has emerged out of the marketplace that John D. Rockefeller was seeing more than 100 years ago would be a fortune was, quote, patent medicine. And so that's what they did. And then, of course, it does get somewhat evil as they burrow their way into the government and take over and stake territory and rig the system against competitors, et cetera. All that is true. But none of that's true with respect to your personal individual doctor. And the system as it is now, it's just sort of like the law of gravity. It just is. And so this is now going to essentially have everybody under its influence pretty much. And it's not, we can't characterize it in the way that we might, because there's so much genius and goodwill and capability within the system as we look at it in broad spectrum that we can't ignore that. We can't flush it all away with a wave of the hand and say that these are the bad people and the evil. This is the dark side, or this is the bad force. This is the empire. No, it's not as simple as that. And so, because it's not as simple as that, now the argument becomes much trickier. Like, actually, this part of what it is that they're saying and doing is very ineffective, and it's leading you down the wrong path, and this is what you need to do. You need to reject that and do this. It's like, forget it. Now we're back to talking about 1 or 2% of the people in the country and in the world are capable of having this kind of judgment and this kind of conscientiousness and follow through. So, yeah, the modern medicine as you see it is what you're going to get, and that's not going to change. Mm-hmm. Not in this century.
See, I hear, very often here at the Fasting Escape and talking with patients is when they do get a reversal of their, for example, high blood pressure or type 2 diabetes, and they've had it for decades.
Yes.
And they just eating a healthy diet and doing the fast and whatnot, all these things can do it better than the medications.
Sure.
Is I hear often that a little bit of disappointment. There appears to be a misunderstanding about what they should have been getting at their medical doctor's office with regards to these chronic diseases.
Yeah.
Now, they don't have any illusions that the emergency room doctor is supposed to tell them how to, reverse something, but
Sure.
But they feel a little bit let down, and so there's a spectrum. So what's going on there?
Well, yeah, a little light goes on, and that's because it would be. It's kind of like let me give you a. Let's suppose that you traded for a long time with I don't know. Let's say it's a plumber, I'm trying to think something else. So there's let's suppose that a better thing is, let's suppose some lawn service, was mowing your lawn, and they were charging you, I don't know, $48 every time. You had a pretty good sized lawn, and you like the guy, you know what I mean, and he did a good job, or seemingly a pretty good job, which he did, and then you find out from the guy around the block who has a very similar deal, has a very similar yard to you, that he's charging him $28. And there's a feeling of kind of betrayal, like you've been had. It's like, what is that? And so this is what's going to happen when someone comes to the Fasting Escape or they grab a book by John McDougall and they read it and they make some changes, and they find out, hey, how come for the last 15 years I've been on this medication, I've been fearing, an early demise, and we've been doing watchful waiting with the medications, and, because we know there's side effects, and then I do this, and it's gone, and it's over, and I don't have to think about this and worry about this, and I'm actually in control. There's a sense of having been had. There's a sense that the physician on the other end of this, did they know? And if it's kind of like a political thing, like who knew and when did you know it? You know what I mean? And if you didn't know, how the hell is that possible? Like how could you be so well educated, so intelligent, and in principle well-meaning, and not know something that is unbelievably basic? And so I think this is the sense. And if you walk out of the Fasting Escape and have had a 10-year pathology reversed in a couple of weeks, you'll walk out, you won't forget that. And, that's where many of us have been. It's like, wow, now I know, it's essentially, now I can't trust them about anything. And it gives you a very jaundiced eye. And then, of course, the more you look into it, there's a tremendous reason to be suspicious and have a jaundiced eye about medicine. So, the more I've looked into cancer treatments in various and assorted conditions, the more I walk away shaking my head and rolling my eyes like that's just a bunch of smoke and mirrors and misery, in order to grab $250,000 out of an insurance plan. Like this is, I think the people in there are, quote, doing what they can, but in so many cases, there is no influence. There's no profit at all from cancer treatment. It's a tremendous money-making scam in many cases, not in all. So this now becomes the problem. With your specific cancer, is what they have nothing other than an expensive scam, or do they actually have something? And the problem is, in every case, you have to be one of those people that can do those differential equations. You have to look up the science. You have to then do your own meta-analysis, because you can't necessarily trust any individual study. You got to look at all the dots. You got to translate their stats into something that means something to you, as opposed to what it is how they present the stats. It's like, I'd like to see the thing at the end that this means the estimation of the effect size of this treatment means that the average patient who gets this treatment, as opposed to not getting this treatment, lives an additional 63 days. That's what I want to see. Like, let's translate this into the actual stats that mean something to human beings, instead of things that are completely obscured and then are publishable behind, a p less than 0.05 in scientific literature, and therefore, quote, statistically significant. How many people know the difference between statistical significance and practical significance? They don't even know that there's two different questions on the table. Who knows that? A few people that took statistics as an undergraduate somewhere and got A's. Okay, so it's sort of infuriating, the labyrinth that you wind up in if you're actually trying to make a decision for yourself about some mutilating or dangerous or incredibly painful heroic procedure that they've come up with. So, is there a reason to be frustrated with the medical system? Absolutely. However, it's like the law of gravity. It may be frustrating, but at some point you have to realize it is what it is, and it's not going away. It is going to be what it's going to be. And for anybody that's in the reach of a podcast, that's at this intellectual level, you are among the people that are smart enough to actually read the materials that are necessary to give you an informed opinion about what the real situation is. And you've actually got the names of the people and the organizations that have the talented people within them that can actually help you get an informed opinion about what your situation is and what might be the best moves. But that's not within the reach of everybody. That's so the great empire will continue, and they're not worried about us, and they're not worried about any of our criticisms. The empire never needs to strike back. It simply owns the landscape, and the world will continue to be to essentially be caught in its flypaper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can imagine it gets frustrating, and this for people who have loved ones who are succumbing to this, and this actually has to do with our next question. So,
sure.
Dr. Lisle, I've listened to all of your webinars with Gustavo, Chef AJ, etc., and you often talk about not worrying about trying to convert others to the True North McDougall way of eating. Mm-hmm. Instead, we should just focus on our own diet and let people find this information on their own if or when they're ready. Mm-hmm. This is fighting our desire to earn esteem by bringing this new information to our modern-day version of our Stone Age village.
Right.
So this approach works very well for me at work and even with friends. Mm-hmm. But in church this week, I felt very guilty. No one is specifically asking me for nutrition advice, but every single week we hear about and pray for different members of our congregation that have everything from kidney stones to cancer to high blood pressure, everything in between. All of these conditions could be helped by a whole food plant-based diet. I don't feel comfortable saying this much about my diet at church, but I feel very guilty about not speaking up if information that I have could actually help someone who's suffering. Do you have any recommendations for this?
Yes, I do. Depends upon, sort of what, how the person feels, how assertive they are, etc. A great book in the world, I don't know, I'm sure it's out of print, but I don't know that there's an equivalent. It could be. You'd have to look and see. I can't remember. When I read The Starch Solution, I can't remember anything about it. Sort of, I remember feeling that it was comprehensive and very good. But one of my favorite books that was ever done was a thing called McDougall's Medicine, A Challenging Second Opinion. And what I liked about that book is that it actually it went through sort of condition by condition, and it gave a second opinion. There was probably like a dozen chapters, and so so if I had this issue and I had a church and I was going to, and there was people that we were praying for that were in serious trouble, for example, I might have myself a little stack of challenging second opinions or something else, or copies of Forks Over Knives, for example. That's even easier for people. And I might say to them, listen, I don't know if this could help you at all. I really don't have any idea. I'm just a little person. But, I watched this video and it seemed pretty inspiring. And it just seemed like these people are saying that that we can sometimes do things that can help ourselves quite a bit. You might just want to take a look at it, just if you feel like it. That's what I do, and that's how I'd say it. So that way you're not being pushy, you're not telling them, you're not making any promises, nothing. You're just giving them a possibility to get exposed to information, and then they can take it on their own. When I think about it, I would probably give them forks over knives, because I don't know how you give people things these days. I guess people do things on Netflix. They don't have DVDs anymore, but I still have DVDs. But you might, VHS, there may be some way to communicate that, and it could be as simple as I don't know, just your a little card with a get well card with a little note in it about forks over knives, and then you hand it to them. You say, I just wrote that down on there for best wishes to you, but I don't. What do I know? It just I thought it was an amazing story, and I don't know, maybe there might be something in it for you. Now we don't have some preachy little situation where it's uncomfortable, that you're saying that there's a whole new way to do things and they should look into it and they can take charge of this and blah blah. We don't set up a haywire dynamic this way. If we do it super subtle, super sideways and very pleasant and soft and tentative, if we do it that way, we're not going to upset anybody. And that's how you can get that message to people that you want to get it to.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's a very tough one. The patients here at Fasting Escape, we're always talking about how they want to bring this to people in their lives, and we use your SEAM strategy, and ultimately you really can't force anybody to eat this way or live this way, and you can't really bring it as much as, I guess, like you said, the top. There's a few percentage of the population that can do it and are open enough to do it and or listen to it. But
you want to make it possible as gently as possible for them to pique their curiosity, so that they look into it themselves, and that's it. Now, if you have done that, if you have simply very gently found a way to bring this to their awareness, that is it. You're done. And there's no profit in pushing and selling it past that point. This has to be something that people have to be sort of inherently interested, curious, and it has to hit them as logical or interesting. And then from there, once exposed to something, as good as forks over knives, for example, I don't know, if there's some militant person with a bunch of tattoos and purple hair, then you send them to What the Health, so they can be all upset about the conspiracy. Okay, but if they're a normal person, I would send them to Forks Over Knives, and I think that's a Lee Fulkerson has a beautiful voice and personal style that feels very honest. Which he is as a narrator and as the guy who goes through this sort of transformation of his own thinking, and it's I think they Brian Wendell and his team just did an outstanding job, and I think that's our best calling card for opening somebody's eyes, but without us forcing it. It's just a chance that they'll sit back and take this in. And then we let these experts like Campbell and Esselstyn and McDougall speak for themselves and speak for this perspective, and that's that. Yeah.
Yeah, I recommend that. When people ask me about it, I do your SEAM strategy, and then I ask them, you may want to watch Forks Over Knives because it's such a well done movie and it's on Netflix, so it's just really easy just to do that. So. All right, so our next couple of questions have to do, so this one has to do with a clinical psychology student. Mm-hmm. So, dear Dr. Lisle, I'm a clinical psychology doctoral candidate, and I will have my first round of patients this fall. Mm-hmm. I'm nervous, excited, but mostly curious. What concepts and theories from evolutionary psychology have you found most useful in your clinical work? And what are the one or two things from evolutionary psychology that I should focus on to help better serve my patients? Better yet, if there are any mistakes that you see young clinicians make that I can avoid, what would those be? What are those? For some background, I'll be mostly working with a college-aged population along with members of the community who range from young adolescents to retirees who present with various symptomology. We get the kitchen sink thrown us, and so to combat some of my unease, I'm continually reading books off of your reading list, along with primary source material. Any suggestions or help would be much appreciated.
Wow. Doctoral student in clinical psychology. That's great. And they're starting to absorb, they're starting to learn now evolutionary psychology if they're reading books that I recommend. In terms of what one or two things are we going to do? Yeah. So what one or two things do you need to make a bicycle? All right. So it's a system of thinking, and the way that I approach things is quite a bit different than is done in any other therapy style. And so so I can't sum this up in one or two things. There's actually a whole host of technique that goes into how it is that I go about trying to hone in on the issues, and then how it is that we work the problems. So I would say that be patient. If you're go ahead and probably do what's going to be an eclectic version of humanism with cognitive therapy is probably what most people are taught, unless you're in some dynamic school, at which point you're being taught some 19th century crazy crap that is not likely to be the case. You're probably being taught and exposed to sort of a mishmash of Rogerian support along with some cognitive therapy ideas, and that's fine for now. And so just stumble forward as best you can with this, and this there's no experience like just being thrown in and having to talk to some bright young people about what their struggles are. And then stay tuned, because myself and some colleagues are at work essentially putting together materials to help clinicians and lay people problem solve from this perspective. And so those will be finished by the time you're finished with your scholastic career, and you'll be ready then and thoroughly facile with the ideas of the conventional schools at this point. And I think you need to. There's nothing like being grounded by your own experience in what the conventional people say before you then go and do it differently, and then you get to experience the difference. So do your best and then stay tuned. That's what I would tell you to do.
Fantastic. All right, Dr. Lisle, we've got a little political question here. So
should have Jen Hawk for this one, but
yeah,
all right. We'll get her back.
Dear Dr. Lisle, I'm a regular listener here over in the UK, and I've just listened to an episode where you dispelled the fallacy of bottling up emotions. Very persuasive and instructive. Yes. My question is this. Given that many core characteristics of personality are genetically predetermined, like the Big Five, and that the evolutionary process of blind variation is bound to produce extremes from which to select potentially useful new traits, aren't there always bound to be some individuals in society who are likely to experience impulses to commit violent acts?
Yes.
With particularly horrific consequences when gun laws allow comparatively easy access to lethal weapons. In the bottling up episode, you said that some people are bound to be shitheads. And so aren't there always bound to be psychopaths, and no amount of moral education, religious observation, or societal conservatism could ever eradicate the problem of mass killings? I would be fascinated to hear your views on the subject.
Yeah, I'm not sure what they're asking. Are they then? Is there a sort of? Are we inferring, when as you read that, Nathan? Are we inferring that the person is is then saying, what do I think about gun control then as a result?
It sounds like it. I think
Okay.
if they're from the UK, which has really, really tight gun control laws, they may be kind of. It sounds to me like they're coming up with some dissonance of, our laws are this way, but they're flying. But we're seeing they're trying to justify these laws because hey, there might be some really bad people out there.
Right. So this is sort of an interesting problem, and it's an interesting problem for society is to try to figure out how to draw the lines, and so it looks like this, and this is probably a Sam Harris type of a question, and first of all the answer is that of course there's always going to be by virtue of genetics. There's going to be people that are going to be at the extreme for low conscientiousness, high disagreeable, and high unstable. So when we put those three combinations together with just enough intelligence to plan and execute on some horrific process, then we're going to have some tragedies. So the question would be, if we lived in a society where it was increasingly difficult to get firearms, could we reduce these tragedies? And the answer is undoubtedly. So you can think about the ultimate of this. If you had a police state where nobody had any weapons other than the police, then it would be virtually impossible to pull off one of these events. That you might be able to, because somebody could steal their cousin who's in the Army's rifle and do it anyway, but probably not. So you could certainly reduce the likelihood of that. The question is, what's the trade-off? And so what are we going to do? Are we going to now say that people that like to hunt in Montana or wherever aren't allowed to hunt because we can't have weapons anymore? And you might say, well, no, I just want greater control over this or that. Well, those are absurd in the fact that there's going to be they're just going to be merely statistical. So if I was sufficiently disagreeable and sufficiently intelligent and sufficiently therefore angry and had some grievance, which I probably would if I was sufficiently disagreeable, and I was low enough in conscientiousness and unstable enough, I'm not going to let the little matter of the fact that I might have to steal my cousin's rifle for a night get in my way, okay? Or that I may have to buy one on the black market. So you start to see that, once you got 15, 20 million guns, there's going to be no practical way to bottle that up, short of some pretty draconian state interference. So then you have to decide whether or not you want that state interference. And so I could envision a society, even in America, potentially 100 years from now, that the entire culture could have changed enough that the people would strongly vote to say, you know what, we want all this wrapped up, and we don't want all these individual guns and etc. We want them all burned and melted down and put into steel bars and set out in the desert, and etc. And that we're all going to go weaponless, okay, except for the few highly efficient people that run the state and their minions. Possible, okay. I don't think it's very likely, but if the democratic process gave rise to that, and there was a Second Amendment, amendment of that or repeal of this, and the whole society went for it, I could, in principle, you could see how such a society would be, and that there would, obviously this is all just pipe culture, historic, sort of futuristic, crazy talk. So the real question is, should we be thinking the cost benefit through right now, and should there be action on this, because you see some of these disagreeable people getting a hold of guns and committing tragedies? So therefore, shouldn't we do something? And is it a burning issue right now that should be front and center of the of the political landscape, etc. No. I mean, it's of course it's worth noting these things, but I think when you understand the kind of changes that you would be seeking, the magnitude of them, and what it is that you would ever likely to get changed, and how much those changes would actually, any good that they would do, I think it's kind of, personally, I would just shrug my shoulders and say, you're not going to move the needle on this by 0.01%. So why even bother? This is the world that we have. It's whether you're in the UK or the United States, you live in a magnificent world, and you live in a world that's incredibly free, where you're extremely safe, and that your odds against some tragedy like this are minuscule. That's pretty good, and part of the price of getting there, and part of the price of sort of establishing that freedom was to have been armed, to have the populace, to have those kinds of to have weaponry available on a fairly widespread basis. And it's also, as many people would point out, I don't know how legitimate this is at present time here, but you need to potentially always be having a check of the citizenry against their government. And maybe you can't, but believe me, there's been people living in tyranny all over the world for a long time that the reason they're in tyranny is because they weren't armed. So the U.S. was, the United States was made by people that said, hey, we're not going to have the government dictate to us this and that, and so we're going to have a check and balance against them. I think that argument has merit. Whether or not it will have merit in the future, or whether it has it now, is debatable. But this is a historical process, and things of this nature and these kinds of decisions appropriately change very, very slowly, with essentially probably changing only with overwhelming evidence. And I don't think that we have overwhelming evidence now that we would all be so much better off if we disarmed a population. I think that those are, interesting questions worth debating, but I don't think that the answer is at all clear. So I think it's more interesting to know how much psychiatric medications may be involved in some of these things. And that's an entirely different question that doesn't get a lot of attention.